Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? A famous line. Most of us have probably studied it at some point in school. But what can Shakespeare teach us about breakthrough? It may seem like an unexpected pairing, but embedded within Shakespeare's plays are deeper lessons on human nature and on one of the harder Breakthrough Manifesto principles: don't play nice. In Romeo and Juliet, we witness the importance of getting the truth on the table before characters meet a perilous end.
And so, to borrow from your Breakthrough Manifesto, the nurse watches the elephant in the room grow. But when she starts to not play nice, it's almost too little, too late. The ship has sailed and she can't save Juliet anymore.
That was Betsy Sullivan, a Shakespearean scholar and educator who focuses on physical and virtual immersion and contemporary Shakespearean adaptations, with an eye toward how innovations in tech might illuminate new readings of old stories. Today we're talking to Betsy about the deep-seated feud between the Montagues and the Capulets in Romeo and Juliet, and exploring which Breakthrough Manifesto principles were at play, or not, throughout this timeless work. I'm Kim Christfort, Chief Innovation Leader for Executive Accelerators in the Deloitte Greenhouse. You're listening to Breakthrough by Design, where we chat with a diverse array of guests, from scientists to CEOs, academics to athletes, exploring what it takes to get to breakthrough. Betsy, welcome.
I'm so happy to be here, Kim.
Excellent. Well, before we jump into the heart of our discussion, I'd love to learn a little bit more about you. And one of my favorite things to know about somebody is where they find inspiration, because that's such a big part of breakthrough. So, what's inspiring you lately?
I like to choose a word that is sort of going to be my guiding word for the year. And the past few years have been about exploration and transformation and nurturing. And a lot of the past few years have just been about collecting things and things that I love. And so this year, my word of the year is vision, and how to trim the fat and make what is already great even better and streamlined. And I've been in a habit of saying no to make room for yeses. When I'm in a situation and feeling a bit uncomfortable, or that my headspace is funny, how can I eliminate the should do's, the could do's for the want to do's? So I've been trying to do the things that I have to do and the things that I want to do in order to just bring more joy and happiness to my life.
This sounds like a great policy for everyone. I'm inspired by you right now. I need to follow this approach.
Yeah, it's been pretty nice. And also, what I've noticed is that it's pretty reciprocal. So, if one of my want to do's has been just to create a more calm morning for my children and I, and if I am more calm, they are more calm. And then we can actually all be loving in the car on the way to school as opposed to upset with each other.
Oh gosh, that sounds idyllic. Now, Betsy, I know we are speaking a lot about Shakespeare today and focusing mostly on Romeo and Juliet, but because you really spend so much of your time thinking about Shakespeare, I'd like to just understand which character you most identify with across Shakespeare's work.
So, this is kind of a funny one, but if you're familiar with As You Like It, it's really one of his plays about two women that are sent out to the forest because one of their fathers, the Duke, is overthrown and they have to disguise themselves as boys. And they go to the forest and they live their most authentic selves. And it's one of his cross dressing plots, and all of these sort of romantic follies happen in the forest, and it becomes the Arden Forest. It's this idyllic place. And I really identify with Rosalind because I used to live in cities, and several years ago, I moved out to the mountains, to Wyoming, and it became my best therapy. I have never had such good therapy in my life as feeling so small and little and humble and wearing myself out in the forest and running into a moose and getting caught in a snowstorm. And it's funny, later in life, in my late 30s, early 40s, of really enjoying being outside and playing as part of my daily taking care of myself.
That's such a great comparison. And it's interesting because you're really talking about this character as somebody who's unlocked your ability to be you and be more authentic, which is one of our Breakthrough Manifesto principles, of course, of getting real. So I think that's a really fascinating, as you say, version of therapy on yourself.
It's the best. I'm probably saving tens of thousands every year.
I love that. So we're really thrilled to have you on our Breakthrough by Design podcast because you bring such a unique angle to thinking about breakthrough. And that is through this lens of studying Shakespeare. So before we dive into some of the connections to breakthrough, could you just tell us a little bit more about your background? How were you inspired to head down this path in the first place?
Sure. I never really had the end goal of pursuing a doctorate in Shakespeare studies. The way that I came to it was I taught high school English and writing in community colleges for a little over 10 years before I returned to my graduate work. And Shakespeare was on every single curriculum. And I always thought it was exciting to read it, but it's because I was an English teacher. And whenever I would introduce a unit, I would look at my students' faces. And maybe there were one or two that had bright eyes and were really engaged, and the rest of them looked some combination of scared, bored, turned off, disengaged. And so, what I realized is that rather than just diving into the history and the story and kind of reading this unapproachable language, is that I would give my students these broad strokes synopses of the plays and the themes, and then have them set out and find a song that resonated with the themes, or a film, or a cultural phenomenon. And it really educated me. And it made me realize how important it is to have access points where we can come at old classics through modern lenses, but also through unknowing audiences, because a lot of my students, they didn't necessarily know these plays, but they were teaching me so much and basically doing comp literature theory in a very high level as an unknowing audience. And so I got really, really, really inspired by it. And I wanted to learn more with the end goal of bringing it to a wider audience as to how to apply some of these ideas. And so I worked on my doctorate in the English department at USC. And I ended up working on a graduate certificate in media studies through the School of Cinematic Arts. And I started playing with the VR labs and the AR labs. And Shakespeare is just a great container because it's so embedded in Western culture to explore experimental forms of storytelling. And it's exciting to see how new tech is breathing fresh air into centuries old stories.
I love how you're making Shakespeare so relatable to a modern audience by embracing some of these experiential and experimental forms of communication. And I'm interested because it sounds like you're really leaning into the fact that these are stories that are actually quite well known, but they're also ones that maybe some people think are stale, been there, done that. How do you think these themes do relate to our broader lives? I mean, why is it important to make them so relatable in our modern times?
This is my little plug for loving the humanities, is that it's about us. It's about us as humans. And one thing that I did not understand about Shakespeare until I really started diving deep is that very few of his stories are original. He was looking at the classics to create his stories as well. There's this idea that there's a through line through all of these stories from ancient texts, from ancient civilizations that are still really instructive about our lives today. That's one thing that I think is really beautiful about looking at the past to understand us now and understanding how we are now to better understand the past.
I love that positioning as it relates to breakthrough because I think sometimes when we talk about breakthrough or think about breakthrough, people are assuming we need to have something that's completely new, that it's never been seen before, that it's this revolutionary invention or innovation. And what you're describing with Shakespeare is that the innovation in many ways is taking this this through line, this story, these common themes, and relating them over time in fresh and new ways. And in fact, that's what you yourself are doing by now taking this and modernizing it with experiential technology.
Absolutely. I think it's such a disservice when only good ideas happen with a sole genius in a vacuum or a sole creative team in a vacuum. Really, the entire world is influencing us, history and future. And that's what I really love about the work that I do.
Now, I know we have a rich body of work when we think about Shakespeare, but we have chosen today to focus mainly on the play Romeo and Juliet and explore the characters through some of our manifesto principles, specifically the one, don't play nice. Now, before we dive into that, though, I think it would be helpful for many of us who have perhaps not revisited Romeo and Juliet since high school English to have the quick storyline of Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah, you got it. It's a tragic love story about Romeo Montague and Juliet Capulet, who fall in love at a party one night, but their parents are sworn enemies. But because they are strong willed, romantic teenagers, they secretly marry anyway, after which Juliet's cousin Tybalt kills Romeo's best friend Mercutio. Romeo, in retaliation, kills Juliet's cousin Tybalt, and Romeo is banished from Verona. Juliet, rather than being forced to marry the guy that her parents want her to marry, takes a potion to fake her own death. And Romeo believes that she has actually died, so he goes to her grave and drinks a potion that kills him. She wakes up right after he's dead, cannot stand to live without him, and then stabs herself with his dagger. And that's the end.
Whew. Yes. Poor Romeo and Juliet. Star-crossed lovers for sure. And just to start us off with our don't play nice, one of the interesting things about Romeo and Juliet as characters is that they actually show the danger of not following that principle. So, in other words, we are advising people to not play nice and tell the truth. But in fact, Romeo and Juliet do exactly the opposite. They play nice, unfortunately, with very tragic consequences. Can you tell us a little bit more about how they're playing nice and maybe why?
Sure. I love that you're saying they play nice to their own detriment because they are so idealistic. And I think this is why they are just such iconic, romantic, beautiful characters. They fall in love at first sight and they believe that their love can conquer hate and repair the gang violence between the Montagues and the Capulets. The thing is, they do it so well. They seduce each other with beautiful language and they really create an otherworldly space. What I love too is that Romeo is a poet in the play. If we look back at the Latin root word poeta, it means a maker or creator. They really create this world of ideas. Also, their language is full of comparisons to natural sources of light. The famous line from Romeo when he describes Juliet as surpassing the beauty of the sun. And he says, "But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief that her maid art far more fair than she." And Juliet, in turn, describes Romeo as the night sky. And she says, "Come, gentle night, come, loving, black browed night, give me my Romeo. And when I die, I take him and cut him out in little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night and pay no worship to the garish sun." So they don't even live on our planet. I mean, they're way out there and they are able to imbue this hope that they can pour their love into their city in Verona. But they do play too nice and they do suffer because of it. Romeo goes so far as to step between Juliet's cousin Tybalt and his best friend when they're dueling. And Mercutio's stabbed. And the saddest thing is that Mercutio then blames Romeo for his death. And because they just have such a sense of idealism, they can't really take things at face value and accept reality.
This is such an important point, I think, for our broader efforts to affect transformative innovation, because breakthrough is fundamentally about identifying that barrier that's holding you back from wherever you want to go and then working your way through it. And what I hear you describing with Romeo and Juliet is that they were already fast forwarding to that future without acknowledging that there was a barrier. They sort of had this lack of attention to this horrible reality. And I love your definition of poeta, this idea of making and creating. That is a big part of breakthrough. You need to come up with these great ideas. You need to create that vision, that exciting future that you're moving toward. But you can't skip over the step of acknowledging that there's something standing in your way of that. And that requires calling out hard truths.
Hmm. I mean, the one thing that they do not address, they act really like, idealistic, reckless people, but they don't call out who is really the source of all this strife, which are their parents. They work only with each other to create their ideal world.
And another great parallel to what we're trying to do here, because having wonderful ideas and a vision of the future can be great. But if you're actually not getting to the people who are actually holding you back from that and converting their thoughts in this new direction and bringing them along on the journey, you are unlikely to be successful. Hopefully, not with the same level of tragic results as we see in Romeo and Juliet, but directionally, it could be a failure. And I think it's interesting to look at other characters who perhaps did a better job of not playing nice. Can you give us some examples of that point of view?
Sure. So the two characters that really do a good job of speaking the truth compassionately, both to Romeo and Juliet and then to us as the audience, and kind of trying to help steer the fate of the play, are the friar and the nurse. And this is very typical of Shakespearean plays because, sure, the friar has some power because he's a man of the cloth, but he's not the prince and he's not super wealthy like the Montagues or Capulets. And then the nurse is perhaps Juliet's closest confidant, but she works for the Capulets. And so it's oftentimes not the people who are in the highest power who do speak the truth. They both just really love Romeo and Juliet. The friar is Romeo's paternal figure. The nurse raised Juliet, was her wet nurse, and is very close to her. And they really, really, really see what is coming down the pipe for Romeo and Juliet. And they try so many times to prevent their death and their suffering. Another reason why I think this play is so popular is that every time I've seen it, read it, watched it, I really believe they might not die this time. You just love the characters and their idealism. And so the friar, he really politicizes the potential for Romeo and Juliet to eradicate the violence in Verona, and he believes that they can do it. Romeo has a hot temper. That's why he is so enticing to Juliet. He is so passionate. And the friar is the one who really puts him in his place and shakes sense into him. There's a scene after Romeo has killed Juliet's cousin Tybalt and he's been banished. And he's bemoaning his fate and saying, "This is so unfair." And the friar repeats to him, "There art thou happy," or in our current terms would say, "That's why you should change your attitude." And I think this is a good example of the friar not playing nice. It's when he sort of pushes up his sleeves and says, "Okay, you might be the person who can create peace for us. You need to stop being so stuck in your own personal hell." And the nurse, on the other hand, she is really protective and she's really, really tender toward Juliet. And so at the very beginning of the story, when Juliet lays eyes on Romeo and is so smitten, the nurse pulls her aside at the party and she says, "His name is Romeo and a Montague, the only son of your great enemy." To which Juliet responds, "My only love sprung from my only hate, too early seen unknown and known too late. Prodigious birth of love it is to me, that I must love a loathed enemy." So essentially, she's so strong willed as well and says, "Well, thank you for letting me know that, but I'm already in love with him." And so the nurse kind of changes her tune, and she wants to play nice because she's Juliet's surrogate mom and she sees how in love they are. And so the nurse is the one who helps arrange the secret marriage plan. But she shifts tunes again and she starts to speak in ways that where she's not playing nice. She urges Juliet to forget about Romeo and marry Paris, who's the eligible bachelor of Verona and the guy that Juliet's parents want her to marry after Romeo kills Tybalt and is banished. And the nurse says to Juliet, "Faith, here it is. Romeo is banished and all the world to nothing, that he dares ne'er come back to challenge you. Or if he do, it needs must be by stealth. Since the case so stands as it now doth, I think it best you married with the county. He's a lovely gentleman. Romeo's a dishclout to him. An eagle, madam, hath not so green, so quick, so fair an eye as Paris hath. Beshrew my very heart. I think you are happy in the second match, for it excels your first, or if it did not, your first is dead, or 'twere as good as he were, as living here, and you no use of him." And so finally, she's a realist, and she's really just trying to save Juliet's life. I mean, Romeo is the ultimate bad boy. He is a murderer. He's banished. He's not a good match for her. He can't keep her safe. And ultimately, she's right. Had Juliet left Romeo by the wayside, she would have married Paris, who also is part of the governance. She would have been protected. And so, to borrow from your Breakthrough Manifesto, the nurse watches the elephant in the room grow. But when she starts to not play nice, it's almost too little, too late. The ship has sailed and she can't save Juliet anymore.
It's fascinating because you're describing essentially a spectrum of niceness. So, on the one hand, you have Romeo and Juliet, who are so idealistic that they're only playing nice and completely ignoring the truths and hoping they, I think, just aren't even there or would go away. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the friar, who actually tries again and again to call out the truth and to change the direction of Romeo's decisions of the story. And then you have the nurse that's interesting in the middle. She's sort of flip flopping. She at first calls out the truth, but then she wants to be supportive of Juliet. And then she calls out the truth. But as you say, maybe too little, too late. She's let that elephant grow and there's nothing you can do at that point. And what this spectrum really makes me think about is this concept behind don't play nice, which we talk about in the book, which is what is the motivation for calling out truth? Why are you doing it? And why are you doing it at the time and in the moment and in the way that you're choosing? Are there other characters that embody the balance well between speaking the truth that others won't, but doing it with positive intent?
To bookend most of the plays, there is a character that steps in and lays bare what has happened in a more neutral way. And in Romeo and Juliet, the play opens with a chorus that gives a preview of what's going to happen. And the chorus really points to the parents as the problem. And then at the very end of the play, the other character who lays bare what has happened and also accepts fault is the Prince of Verona. He says, "Where be these enemies, Capulet Montague? See what a scourge is laid upon your hate, that heaven finds mean to kill your joys with love. And I, for winking at your discords too, have lost a brace of kinsmen. All are punished." And so he clearly blames the Capulets and the Montagues for the fact that their kids are dead, but he also blames himself. It's a different line than we would use now, but he says, "I for winking at your discords." So basically for turning a blind eye to what was right in front of me, have lost a brace of kinsmen. And Mercutio was kin to the prince. It's again a little too late, but you can see maybe there's a kernel of hope there that so much tragedy has happened that he might affect change in the future, that he accepts his faults, he is not absolving himself, and he's admonishing all involved.
One of the interesting things about the examples you're giving with the chorus in the beginning and the prince at the end is that they're really bookending, in a sense, the bigger insight. As you say, the parents are the problem. There is something right in front of our eyes, that is the problem here. And I think similarly, as we look into our broader world today, So often the problem is right in front of us from the beginning. And we don't always have the benefit of that book ending of the narrative to sort of tell us, hey, this thing's going to be a problem. And then later, yep, it was a problem. We were right. And yet, if we start looking and really taking a step back and thinking about what is our narrative in day to day life, those truths are there to be seen. Shakespeare just does a beautiful job of both having it be part of the broader construct for our audiences as they're going into the story, and then also teasing out those nuances with the individual characters during the story. I know there are many other minor characters as well who play nice or not, largely due to the social dynamics at play in Verona at the time. Can you talk a little bit about how societal expectations or norms might influence how characters interact with each other, how that might serve them or not to speak the truth, and how Shakespeare addresses that?
Sure. We touched on this a little bit. The nurse, she holds a lot of the protection and the wisdom for Juliet, but she is a servant of the Capulet household. And that is a huge, huge element of Shakespearean plays, that the characters who are the most likely to speak the truth and the most earthy philosophical kernels of truth are typically of the lower classes, because so many of these plays are about nobility, kings, queens, princes, dukes, etc. But it's typically the jesters, the clowns, the grave diggers, the fools who are the ones who can really step up and speak the truth. And I think there's a narrative methodology and reason behind this, and that's these characters often are also offering comic relief and points of really dramatic tension within the play. And then also, it's just a purely practical storytelling technique that Shakespeare was very good at, because his audiences were compiled of people of the noble class, of the merchant class, of the gallants, the knights, and then also just a bunch of people that were regular people who wanted to go have some entertainment. And they might have comprised even a larger portion of the audiences. Just to put this into context, the Globe, where Shakespeare produced all of his plays in the Elizabethan area, could hold 3,000 people. And around that time in London, I think the population was around 200,000 people. So you're getting a huge cross section of people coming to see this. And so I think Shakespeare was very, very masterful in not just saying the upper class hold all the knowledge. Knowledge is held by every human. And there's a scene in Hamlet, actually, is really famous. It's towards the end of the play, and he's trying to figure out how to redeem his father's death. And he goes to a graveyard, and the grave diggers are singing songs and misspeaking words and throwing bones around and basically cracking a bunch of jokes. But they say, this is the Yorick, the man of infinite jest, which is such a famous term from Shakespeare. But ultimately, they tell the prince of Denmark, you know what? In the end, it doesn't matter if you're a prince or a gravedigger, we all get eaten by worms. And that is kind of a driving universal theme in Hamlet. Everyone succumbs. You can't outsmart death.
It's kind of the ultimate don't play nice statement. You may think you're powerful, but ultimately you're going to be worm meat. And that's the hard truth.
Exactly.
And of course, we've been focused very much on the principle don't play nice in terms of getting to breakthrough, but perhaps the most obvious principle to connect this to is our principle of dialing up the drama. And a big aspect of dialing up the drama, of course, is tapping into human emotions through these universal themes. Can you give us examples of how Shakespeare brings that emotion to life and gets those points across at a deep human level?
hmm I think that a lot of humans feel more comfortable, or at least I certainly do, kind of buying into drama and buying into a story if I sort of feel comfortable with what's going to happen next. So, Act One establishes the conflict. Act 2 increases the action. Act 3, you reach a boiling point of what's going to happen next. Act 4 is the climax. Act 5 is the resolution. So there's sort of this soaring emotional arc that we understand is going to happen. The other thing that Shakespeare does, and obviously the plays are so famous for their beautiful language, and you can get lost in the language, in particular the language between Romeo and Juliet. I mean, it's been quoted and pulled in so many different ways. And one thing too is that contemporary audiences are better listeners at plays than Elizabethan audiences. They were not good listeners. They treated plays as a social event. So it was totally cool to talk through the entire play, to sing. People would dance. They conducted business. They ate. They drank. I mean, it was a really wild scene. And so the language is really repetitive, and a lot of alliteration and those poetic devices. There's a good example of kind of how Shakespeare foregrounds what's happening and then repeats it throughout the play, is going back to this idea of the prologue at the beginning of the play. The prologue in 14 lines gives us a preview and says, "Star-crossed lovers take their life." The prologue also bluntly says that the continuance of their parents' rage, but by their children's end, none could remove. And this is then repeated in the middle of the play when Mercutio, it's such a horrible, dramatic scene when Juliet's cousin and Romeo's best friend duel. And then Romeo steps into the middle, but Mercutio still dies. And as he's dying, he's screaming at his best friend, "A plague on both your houses." And he repeats this 3 times in the play. And so not only are we sort of in this agony with Romeo, watching his best friend die and taking responsibility for it, but we also are aware of this wider thing that we know Romeo is also about to die for the same thing. So Shakespeare is so good at having these multi-layered stories going on at the same time that the audience is aware of, even if the characters are not.
First of all, I didn't know this about all the craziness happening during during the theater production. So I find that so interesting, but it's also a good reminder that we are all distracted all the time with so many things going on in business and personal life and emails coming in and calls and all these things, and that if you really want to make change, you actually need to speak the truth and speak it again and speak it again. And this idea of repeating a message throughout to get the attention of playgoers is equally relevant to us repeating our message throughout to get to breakthrough change.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I love that. I love that. Comparing the distraction of the Elizabethan day to the contemporary era. See, we're just humans are always the same.
And it's all about Shakespeare, right? And yet I know you were really passionate about people not believing that. Shakespeare, we could sort of hold up as this great example of this gateway to knowledge and wisdom. But I know you have a different perspective on that. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I would love to talk more about that. One thing that I think is really, really, really important to studying Shakespeare and keeping these stories really, of course, I respect and I hold in high veneration all of the stories. But one thing that I think is so important is that Shakespeare didn't operate as a sole genius scribbling these plays that just sprung from his brain. You know, he was looking at previous texts, he was reading Ovid, he was reading Holinshed's Chronicles, he was listening about shipwrecks that were happening as people were exploring the world. And also, he relied heavily on his actors to help develop lines. There's also a lot of evidence that when the printmakers would print the scripts, they would tweak things that they thought sounded silly. And then also, audience members that would go and would jot down lines, they would then give them, that would go into a vault of ephemera. That when finally all these plays were transcribed and collected, that was all part and parcel. So it really was more like a actor's studio, or I should say a director and producer's studio, that is what we consider now Shakespeare.
It's interesting because it's a beautiful link actually to our principle of enlist a motley crew. There were actually many, many people and parts to actually making this take shape and the way that it's evolved over time.
I love that. That's one thing that certainly as a younger student, I didn't understand that. I think that's part of the intimidation of Shakespeare is that you believe that he was just this great genius who came up with all these insane plays and bodies of work when it was a team effort, and it continues to be a team effort with all the film adaptations and the play adaptations that all of these new directors and producers are creating, and all these great new actors as well.
Excellent. So, Betsy, I have been so inspired by your take on Shakespeare and the relevance to not only modern times, but to us in our search for breakthrough and in the process of developing the mindset, whether it's not playing nice or whether it's dialing up the drama, enlisting a motley crew, and ultimately making change. I would love to hear from you a last question answer to something that we ask everybody on the show, which is, in your opinion, what does breakthrough mean?
I love this question. In moments where I have been stymied by work or questions or research problems, I return back to the quote by Thich Nhat Hanh and the idea of no mud, no lotus. If you are not a little bit lost, a little bit murked out, there's not an impetus to try other venues or repose the question or perhaps take a minute and look around. And so I think that element of confusion has forced me to try different methods. And that's when my biggest discoveries have happened.
I have not heard that before, but no mud, no lotus. It makes great sense. Betsy, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Kim. This was so fun.
This was such an engaging discussion with Betsy as we dove deep into Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. We explored Shakespeare's relevance and the deep connection to the human experience, even today. We highlighted our Breakthrough Manifesto principle, don't play nice, and discussed the dangers of playing nice to one's own detriment. It was a fantastic and rich discovery of Shakespeare's characters and their struggles, ultimately underscoring the importance of confronting hard truths for transformative change. If you want to learn more about Betsy and other leaders who are sparking transformative innovation in their fields, visit breakthroughmanifesto.com. Thank you for listening to Breakthrough by Design, where we believe everyone has the potential for breakthrough.
This podcast is produced by Deloitte. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Deloitte. This podcast provides general information only and is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, go to deloitte.com/about.